A homeless man thinks he can run my kitchen? Marcus Chin's voice cut through the restaurant like a blade as he gestured toward the sputtering grill station. His Rolex caught the dining room lights as he dramatically waved away imaginary smoke. God, you even smell like the street. David Martinez froze in the service entrance, his weathered military jacket still damp from rain. 40 diners stared at him like he'd contaminated their $200 meals. Marcus stood up, his Italian leather shoes clicking against imported tile. He walked close enough that David could smell his cologne mixed with contempt. Here's a deal, street soldier. Cook a perfect beef Wellington that my Michelin-trained chef couldn't master, and I'll give you this entire restaurant. He snapped his fingers inches from David's face. When you fail, and you will, police will escort you out permanently. The dining room fell silent. A $3 million Michelin star bid hung on this impossible dish. Have you ever been dismissed so completely that someone bet their empire you'd fail? Chin's Metropolitan rose from Manhattan's financial district like a glass temple to culinary ambition. The 12-story building housed New York's most exclusive fusion restaurant, where billion-dollar deals were sealed over handcrafted dishes that cost more than monthly rent in most American cities. Marcus Chun had built this empire with calculated precision. At 42, he commanded respect through intimidation and social media influence. His slick-back hair always perfect, his custom suits tailored to Project Power. The food world called him a visionary. His kitchen staff whispered different words behind stainless steel doors. The restaurant's crown jewel sat incomplete on the expo line. A Michelin-worthy beef Wellington. This wasn't just any dish. It represented 8 months of development, 23 recipe iterations, and the culinary dreams of Marcus's head chef, Pierre Rousseau, who'd trained under Gordon Ramsay himself. For 11 weeks, this dish had defied perfection. 5 different attempts during Michelin inspector visits had failed. 87 test runs had yielded nothing but frustration and mounting pressure. The beef would cook unevenly, the pastry would either burn or remain soggy, and the Duxelles mushroom mixture would leak, creating what food critics called catastrophic structural failure. Michelin's anonymous inspector had visited twice already. Industry insiders whispered that one more perfect evening would secure Chin's Metropolitan its 3rd star, a status achieved by only 137 restaurants worldwide. That 3rd star meant $8 million in annual revenue increases, international recognition, and Marcus's face on magazine covers from Tokyo to Paris. But the inspector's notes from previous visits were brutal, ambitious but inconsistent. The beef Wellington, signature dish, lacks the precision expected at this level. Pastry integrity compromised. Internal temperature variance of 12 degrees across the protein. Unacceptable for 3-star consideration. David Martinez knew every inch of Chin's Metropolitan from the outside. For 4 months, he'd slept in the service alley behind the restaurant's dumpsters, invisible to the executives and celebrities who stepped over him like discarded furniture. His official status read, displaced veteran, but everyone knew the truth. He was another casualty of America's wars, another soldier who'd come home to a country that forgot its promises. His culinary training at the CIA, Culinary Institute of America, not the spy agency, felt like a lifetime ago. That was before Kabul, before the IED blast that killed his sous chef and best friend, before the PTSD that made him unemployable in kitchens where sharp objects and sudden noises triggered episodes that scared employers away. While his culinary school classmates had become executive chefs at 5-star hotels, David had chosen survival. His Army disability checks covered medication, not Manhattan rent. The therapy sessions cost $180 each. Insurance covered 50%. The math was simple and devastating. The Michelin crisis deepened each day. Marcus's morning meetings with Pierre grew louder, his demands more unreasonable. He paced the kitchen like a caged animal, his shoes clicking against tile in sharp, angry rhythms that made line cooks flinch. Broken plates accumulated in the dish pit like archaeological evidence of his mounting desperation. 11 weeks, he screamed at the kitchen staff during Tuesday's disaster service. That's how long we've been failing at one dish. One dish that could make us immortal in culinary history or destroy everything I've built in 15 years. Pierre Rousseau, trained at Le Cordon Bleu, sat exhausted in his chef's whites, the fabric stained with the evidence of another failed attempt. His team had tried everything. Different beef grades, Wagyu, dry-aged prime, grass-fed organic. They'd tested puff pastry from 7 different suppliers, made it from scratch using European butter, even flew in a pastry specialist from Paris. Marcus's eyes swept the kitchen like searchlights, hunting for someone to blame. "Maybe we have too many people who don't belong here," he said, his gaze lingering on David as he quietly moved past the service entrance, heading toward his alley sleeping spot. "Dead weight that's dragging down our entire operation." The comment hit its mark. Several kitchen staff members glanced at David, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to barely concealed agreement. Sarah Kim, a sous chef from the Institute of Culinary Education, shifted uncomfortably. She'd worked 16-hour days for 11 weeks and couldn't solve the problem. Yet somehow the suggestion that a homeless veteran might be the weak link made twisted sense in their exhausted minds. David pretended not to hear. He'd learned that invisibility was survival in this city. But his culinary mind couldn't stop analyzing the problem. Late at night, when he positioned his sleeping bag near the kitchen's ventilation grate, he'd study the sounds and smells escaping into the alley. The technique specifications told a story the chefs seemed to miss. They were treating beef Wellington like French haute cuisine, but the dish was British, created for the Duke of Wellington. It required different pastry handling, different moisture management, and most critically, a different understanding of how beef and pastry communicate during cooking. The French approach was too delicate. This dish demanded the robust technique of British officers' mess halls, where food needed to survive transport and presentation delays. The pressure mounted like steam in a closed kitchen. Security footage from the previous week showed Marcus deliberately scheduling street cleaning during dinner service, forcing David to move while wealthy diners watched through windows. He'd point him out to restaurant investors, his voice carrying just loud enough. "We support veterans' causes. Even donate our scraps." His tone suggested charity rather than respect. Email chains revealed worse. Kitchen communications referred to him as that homeless guy, despite his CIA credentials. One particularly cruel thread, initiated by Marcus himself, speculated about whether David even remembered how to hold a knife. The Michelin inspector was scheduled to return on Friday evening, 5 days away. Industry sources confirmed this would be the final evaluation visit. Either Chen's Metropolitan earned its 3rd star, or the opportunity would vanish for another year, maybe forever. Competitors were already circling, sensing blood in the water. Marcus had invested everything in this moment. He borrowed $2 million from private investors specifically to fund the restaurant's elevation campaign. New kitchen equipment from Germany, rare ingredient suppliers from Japan, a wine cellar expansion that cost more than most people's houses. If the 3rd star didn't materialize, those investors would demand repayment he couldn't provide. The New York Times food critic had published a preview article titled, "Chen's Metropolitan, So Close to Greatness." The piece praised the restaurant's ambition while noting the Wellington's persistent imperfection. Marcus Chun has built everything except the signature dish that would define his legacy, the article concluded. 20 million readers absorbed that assessment. Wednesday brought new complications. Pierre Rousseau, the head chef, was hospitalized with exhaustion and stress-induced cardiac symptoms. Not a heart attack, but close enough to terrify the kitchen staff. His second-in-command, Thomas Wu, had the technical skills but lacked Pierre's intuitive understanding of complex dishes. Marcus convened emergency meetings with culinary consultants. He'd already spent $180,000 on specialists, a pastry expert from London who charged $15,000 for 3 days of consultation, a meat scientist from Texas A&M who analyzed protein fiber structures, even a food psychologist who suggested the kitchen's negative energy was affecting the dish's outcome. None of it worked. The beef Wellington remained stubbornly imperfect. David watched this desperation unfold from his alley vantage point. Through the ventilation grate, he heard Thomas Wu arguing with Marcus about impossible expectations. The dish requires 23 minutes at 400 degrees, but the crust burns at 18 minutes. The beef needs to rest for 12 minutes, but the pastry gets soggy if we wait that long. Physics is working against us. But David heard something they didn't. During his late-night hours near the kitchen exhaust, he detected the problem through smell and sound. The high-end convection ovens Marcus had installed were too powerful, too efficient. They were designed for precise French pastry work, not the robust heat management required for British meat pies, which was essentially what beef Wellington was. The dish needed old-school technique, a standard deck oven with uneven heat distribution that created hot spots and cool zones. The beef needed the hot zone for searing while wrapped. The pastry needed the cool zone for gentle crisping. Modern precision was killing the dish's soul. David's military training had taught him about improvisation under pressure. In Kabul, he'd cooked for 200 soldiers using field equipment and supply chain disasters. He'd made Thanksgiving dinner in a combat zone using a modified diesel heater as an oven. He'd learned that the best food came from understanding limitations, not fighting against them. His mind kept returning to Chef Raymond, his instructor at CIA, who'd survived Vietnam and understood that military experience created unique culinary instincts. Soldiers know how to adapt, Raymond had said. You don't need perfect equipment. You need perfect understanding of your ingredients and your heat source. Marcus's social media presence amplified the pressure. His Instagram account, with 2.3 million followers, documented the restaurant's journey toward Michelin greatness. Posts showed behind-the-scenes development, celebrity diners, and carefully curated images of culinary artistry. But the comments section had turned savage. Followers sensed desperation, and internet culture smelled blood. Day 77 without perfecting our signature dish. One recent post read, showing a failed Wellington attempt. The comments were brutal, maybe aim for 2 stars. Gordon Ramsay would shut you down. All money, no skill. The viral mockery was destroying Marcus's carefully constructed image. His investor calls grew more desperate. Kitchen staff morale crumbled. The restaurant's reservation system showed troubling cancellations. Wealthy diners postponing visits until after the Michelin decision, not wanting to waste money on potential failure. Friday approached like an execution date. The kitchen needed a miracle, but miracles required believers. And Chin's Metropolitan had run out of faith in everything except expensive consultants who'd already failed. Thursday afternoon brought the final crisis. Thomas Wu attempted one last Wellington practice run during prep time. The kitchen staff gathered around like mourners at a funeral, watching the dish emerge from the oven with the same structural failure that had plagued every previous attempt. The pastry bottom had dissolved into soggy paste while the top had burned to dark amber. The beef's internal temperature varied by 15 degrees from end to end. Thomas slammed his chef's knife onto the cutting board with enough force to make line cooks jump. It's impossible. The laws of thermodynamics are against us. We need to tell Marcus we're changing the signature dish. Marcus exploded into the kitchen like a hurricane. His custom suit jacket was already removed, his silk tie loosened, signs that his control was slipping. He'd been on the phone with investors who were asking pointed questions about repayment timelines. Change the dish. His voice echoed off stainless steel surfaces. 4 days before the Michelin inspector returns. That's your professional recommendation. He grabbed the failed Wellington and held it up like evidence at a trial. This represents everything we've built. This is what separates us from every other fusion restaurant in Manhattan. And you want to surrender? The kitchen staff stood frozen, unsure whether to defend Thomas or hide from Marcus's rage. That's when David made his mistake. He'd entered through the service entrance to ask the dishwasher for spare vegetables, something the staff occasionally provided when Marcus wasn't watching. The oven's wrong for that dish, David said quietly, his voice carrying through the sudden silence that Marcus's outburst had created. Every head turned toward him like synchronized machinery. Marcus's face transformed through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, rage, then something far more dangerous: opportunity. Excuse me. Marcus approached David slowly, deliberately, like a predator who'd spotted wounded prey. Did the homeless man just critique my $47,000 German convection oven? David met his gaze steadily, his military training overriding his survival instincts to stay invisible. Sir, beef Wellington isn't French pastry. It's a British officer's dish. It needs uneven heat, not precision. That's why every attempt fails the same way. Marcus's expression shifted again. The restaurant's dining room was starting to fill with early dinner reservations. Wealthy patrons who would witness whatever happened next. His social media manager was already recording, sensing viral content. Perfect, Marcus said, his voice dropping to theatrical whisper that carried throughout the kitchen. Let's make this interesting. You think you understand my kitchen better than CIA-trained chefs? Better than consultants who've worked in 3 Michelin-star restaurants across Europe? The real challenge was about to begin. What Marcus didn't know about David would change everything. San Antonio, Texas, 2001. The military town sprawled across the landscape like a testament to American power, but for David Martinez, age 15, it meant something simpler. His grandfather's restaurant on the south side, where flour dust hung in the air like sacred incense. Sergeant Major Roberto Martinez had served 28 years in the Army, including 2 tours in Vietnam, before retiring to open Martinez's family kitchen in 1987. At 68, he moved with the deliberate grace of a combat veteran turned culinary artist, his weathered hands shaping tamales and tortillas with the same precision he'd once used to field strip an M16 in complete darkness. David pressed his face against the kitchen window every Saturday morning, watching his grandfather work magic with ingredients that other cooks dismissed. Abuelo could take the toughest cuts of meat, the ones grocery stores marked down for quick sale, and transform them into dishes that made customers weep with nostalgia. Then a key, mijo, Roberto called without looking up from the carnitas he was tending. Time you learned something useful about survival. That summer changed everything. While other teenagers played video games and chased girls, David spent his days in the cathedral of heat and tradition that was his grandfather's kitchen. Roberto had been one of the first Mexican-American mess sergeants to feed integrated units in Vietnam, breaking barriers in the 1960s when such achievements required extraordinary courage and skill beyond cooking. "Listen close," Roberto would say, placing David's small hand over a pot of simmering mole sauce. "This dish has a heartbeat. 7 different chilies, each one speaking at a different time. 17 ingredients total, each one critical. You rush it, you disrespect it. You listen to it, it'll never lie to you." The old man's philosophy was simple but profound. "Mijo, food doesn't care about your rank or your medals. It only responds to those who truly respect its nature. Some dishes want to be cooked fast and hot. That's their personality. Others need low, slow, patient heat. Your job isn't to force them. It's to understand what they're asking for." Roberto taught David to diagnose ingredients through touch, smell, even sound. The sizzle pattern when meat hit the pan could indicate moisture content. A particular aroma might reveal whether vegetables were fresh or starting to decline. These weren't skills taught in culinary schools. They were battlefield wisdom passed down through generations of soldiers who'd kept troops fed under impossible conditions. The lessons extended beyond cooking. Roberto had survived decades in a military that didn't always welcome men who looked like him or spoke Spanish as their first language. He'd earned respect through undeniable competence, feeding thousands of soldiers with limited supplies, broken equipment, and supply chains that failed regularly. "White officers going to test you twice as hard," he told David during those long summer afternoons in the kitchen's heat. "Going to assume you're half as qualified. But food doesn't lie, mijo. When you feed someone something perfect, something that makes them close their eyes and remember their mother's table, suddenly your last name doesn't matter so much." By age 18, David could break down and prepare entire animals, understood the intricate chemistry of sauces and stocks better than most culinary school graduates. The Culinary Institute of America accepted him with a partial scholarship based on a video submission that showed him preparing a 7-course meal using only ingredients from a food bank donation box. But life had other plans. Roberto died during David's second year at CIA, not from combat injuries or old age, but from contaminated lettuce in an E. coli outbreak that killed 12 people across Texas. The irony was crushing. A man who'd survived Vietnam and decades of professional cooking, killed by corporate food safety negligence. The funeral overflowed with veterans, former customers, and young cooks Roberto had mentored over 30 years. They spoke of his genius, his generosity, his ability to create beauty from scraps. An Army general presented the family with Roberto's Vietnam service medals and said, "Sergeant Major Martinez won more battles with his cooking than most soldiers win with weapons. He kept us human when humanity was in short supply." The restaurant closed forever. The equipment was auctioned to pay medical bills and legal fees from a lawsuit against the lettuce distributor that would take years to settle for pennies. David's inheritance wasn't money. It was knowledge, instinct, and a philosophy that would sustain him through a decade of being underestimated. When David deployed to Afghanistan in 2008 as an Army cook, he carried Roberto's philosophy like a sacred flame. In Kabul, he ran field kitchens that fed 400 soldiers daily using equipment that broke constantly and supply chains that delivered the wrong ingredients at random intervals. His mess hall became legendary. Soldiers requested transfers to his base specifically for the food. Morale in his units ran higher than anywhere else in theater. Generals visited and left impressed that someone could create restaurant-quality meals using field-expedient methods and military surplus ingredients. The IED blast in 2011 shattered more than David's body. His best friend and sous chef, Marcus Williams, died instantly. David survived with traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and survivor's guilt that made returning to professional kitchens impossible. The sharp knives triggered flashbacks. The loud noises sent him diving for cover. Employers called him a liability. But Roberto's voice echoed in his mind during the darkest moments. The food doesn't care about your circumstances, Mijo. It just wants someone who understands its language. Standing in Chin's metropolitan kitchen, facing Marcus's predatory smile and 40 skeptical professional cooks, David felt his grandfather's presence like a warm hand on his shoulder. The kitchen transformed into a gladiatorial arena. Word spread through the restaurant like wildfire. Something unprecedented was happening in the heart of Chin's metropolitan. Servers abandoned their stations. Dishwashers emerged from the pit. Even diners left their tables, drawn by the commotion and the promise of drama that would become dinner party stories for years. Marcus Chin stood at the expo line like a ringmaster, his theatrical instincts fully engaged. This wasn't just about a single dish anymore. This was about dominance, about reminding everyone who held power in his kingdom. But it was also about desperation. If a homeless veteran could solve his Wellington problem, Marcus would swallow his pride and use the solution. "Here are the stakes," Marcus announced, his voice projecting through the kitchen with practiced authority. "You have exactly 2 hours to prepare a perfect beef Wellington. Not good, perfect. Michelin 3-star perfect." He gestured toward 3 people who'd just entered through the main dining room. James Whitmore, food critic for the New York Times. Catherine Morrison, a Michelin consultant who'd publicly stated she was observing restaurants this week. And Chef Daniel Corso, who owned 4 Michelin-starred restaurants across 3 countries. These 3 will judge blindly. They won't know who cooked what until after they've made their decision. Thomas will prepare our current best attempt using the existing recipe and technique. You'll prepare your version using whatever you think is correct. David's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't just about proving himself. It was about directly challenging the head chef in front of industry authorities. Thomas Wu looked simultaneously insulted and intrigued, his professional ego bruised, but his curiosity engaged. Marcus continued, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. "If Thomas's Wellington is judged superior, you're arrested for trespassing and banned from this neighborhood permanently. I'll press every charge my lawyers can invent." The kitchen staff shifted uncomfortably. This had escalated from humiliation to potential criminal consequences. "But if your Wellington is judged superior," Marcus paused for theatrical effect, "I'll give you Thomas's position as head chef, with a salary of $180,000 annually, plus percentage of profits. You'll oversee this kitchen and fix whatever is broken in our operation." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Head chef positions at restaurants of this caliber were career pinnacles. The offer was absurd and genuine. Marcus was desperate enough to mean it. But there was more. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened Instagram Live. "We're streaming this entire challenge to my 2.3 million followers. Let the world see what happens when confidence meets competence, or when arrogance meets reality." Within seconds, the notification went out. Viewers began flooding in, 1,000, 5,000, 12,000. The comments section scrolled too rapidly to read individual messages, but the tone was clear. Skepticism mixed with morbid fascination. Catherine Morrison, the Michelin consultant, stepped forward with professional authority. At 54, she'd evaluated over 600 restaurants across her career. Her assessment could make or break a chef's reputation. "I'll serve as the official witness to ensure fairness. Both chefs will have access to identical ingredients, identical equipment, and identical time constraints." She looked directly at David, her expression unreadable. "Young man, do you understand the stakes? This isn't about pride. Your freedom and future are on the line. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed?" David met her gaze steadily. The PTSD symptoms that usually plagued him, the hypervigilance, the anxiety, the racing heartbeat, had settled into focused calm. This was familiar territory. Combat cooking had taught him to perform under pressure that made restaurant stress seem manageable. "Ma'am, I've cooked for soldiers in combat zones with mortars landing outside the mess tent. I've made Thanksgiving dinner using a diesel heater and MRE components. Beef Wellington in a professional kitchen with unlimited ingredients? That's a gift." Catherine nodded slowly. Something in his eyes reminded her of the legendary chefs she'd known who'd come from military backgrounds. That combination of discipline, adaptability, and unshakable confidence under pressure that separated true talent from mere technical skill. James Whitmore, the Times critic, pulled out his leather-bound notebook. For the record, I'm documenting this entire process. Regardless of outcome, this is a story New York needs to hear. The culinary world has become too insulated, too credential-focused. Perhaps we need reminders that genius can emerge from unexpected places. Chef Daniel Corso remained silent, but his expression suggested professional interest. He built his empire by recognizing talent wherever it appeared, and something about this situation had triggered his instincts. Marcus checked his Rolex with theatrical precision. Your 2 hours begin now. The challenge was officially accepted. 2 hours to prove or destroy a lifetime of hard-won expertise. The kitchen waited like a mechanical judge, its ovens and burners ready to reveal truth through temperature and time. The crowd pressed against every available viewing space. Smartphones recorded from multiple angles. The Instagram live viewer count hit 50,000 and kept climbing. 2 prep stations were established side by side. Thomas Wu on the left, surrounded by his brigade of sous chefs and prep cooks who'd been executing the failing Wellington for 11 weeks. David on the right, completely alone, with empty counter space that emphasized his isolation. Catherine Morrison personally verified the ingredients. Identical beef tenderloins, both USDA prime, both 3.2 pounds, both trimmed to specification. Identical puff pastry from the same batch. Identical mushrooms, shallots, herbs, and prosciutto. The same Dijon mustard, the same egg wash, the same everything. Equipment access is open, Catherine announced. Either chef may use any oven, any burner, any tool in this kitchen. Choose wisely. Thomas immediately began his process with military precision, following the recipe that consultants had refined over 11 weeks. His team moved like synchronized machinery, one prep cook mincing mushrooms for duxelle, another reducing wine and shallots, a third prepping herbs. David stood motionless for the first 3 minutes, simply observing the kitchen. His eyes tracked the layout, the equipment placement, the ventilation patterns. His grandfather's voice echoed. Before you cook, understand your battlefield. First discovery, the equipment problem. David walked to the gleaming German convection ovens that had cost Marcus $47,000. He opened the door, felt the heat pattern with his hand held at different heights, listened to the fan system. Then he moved to the older deck ovens in the back corner. The original equipment that Marcus had kept for rustic bread baking, but largely ignored. He opened the deck oven and smiled slightly. The heat distribution was uneven, exactly as he'd expected. Hot spots near the heating elements, cooler zones toward the front. This was what beef Wellington needed. I'll be using the deck oven, David announced. Thomas looked up from his prep station, confused. That oven has no temperature precision, no convection fan for even heat. It's basically a cave with fire. Exactly, David replied. Beef Wellington was invented in 1815 to honor the Duke of Wellington's victory at Waterloo. The ovens they used were stone hearths with wood fire, uneven heat, hot spots and cool zones. The dish was designed for that environment. Catherine Morrison's pen moved rapidly across her notebook. Chef Corso leaned forward with sudden interest. David continued, his confidence growing as the technical logic unfolded. Your convection ovens are too perfect. They distribute heat evenly, which sounds good, but beef Wellington isn't a soufflé or a macaron. It's a British meat pie dressed up in French pastry. It needs that rough heat. He pointed to the failed Wellington from Thomas's earlier attempt. Look at the failure pattern. The bottom is soggy, the top is burned, and the beef is unevenly cooked. That's because your convection fan is pushing heat equally everywhere. The pastry can't crisp on the bottom because it's trapped against the pan with steam from the beef. The top burns because it's getting constant direct heat. Second discovery, the pastry treatment. While Thomas's team rolled out puff pastry to precise thickness using a French technique, keeping everything cold, working quickly, creating hundreds of delicate layers, David did something different. He took his puff pastry and deliberately let it warm to room temperature. Thomas gasped audibly. You're destroying the butter layers. They'll melt together. That's first-week culinary school failure. David nodded calmly. For French pastry, yes. But this isn't croissants. This needs to be structurally strong enough to hold hot beef and mushrooms for 15 minutes without collapsing. British pastry for meat pies is always less delicate than French pastry for desserts. He rolled the pastry thicker than traditional puff, nearly double the standard thickness. The Instagram live comments exploded with culinary students and professional chefs arguing about whether this was genius or madness. Then David did something that made every trained chef in the room cringe. He docked the bottom pastry layer with a fork, creating tiny holes throughout. "You're letting steam escape," Thomas's sous chef protested. "That'll make it dry." "No," David explained patiently. "I'm preventing steam from getting trapped between the beef and the pastry bottom. Trapped steam creates that soggy bottom you've been fighting for 11 weeks. These holes let moisture escape downward into the hot part of the deck oven, where it evaporates harmlessly." Catherine Morrison stopped writing and just stared, her professional fascination completely engaged. Third discovery, the cooking sequence. Thomas followed the standard Wellington protocol. Sear the beef, cool completely, wrap with duxelle and prosciutto, encase in pastry, egg wash, then into the oven for 25 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. David took a different approach entirely. First, he prepared his duxelle mushroom mixture but added something unexpected: dried breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs absorb the moisture that mushrooms release during cooking, he explained to the camera that was now focused on his station. Classic French technique says never add breadcrumbs to duxelle. It's considered crude. But British cooks understood that moisture management is more important than culinary snobbery. He seared his beef hard and fast, creating a deep crust. But instead of cooling it completely, he only let it rest for 5 minutes, just long enough to stop actively dripping juice. "The beef needs to still be warm when it goes into the oven," David said. "If it's cold, the temperature differential is too extreme. The outside burns before the inside comes to temperature. But if it enters the oven already warm, the temperature curve is gentler." Chef Corso stood up and moved closer, his professional interest fully triggered. This was heterodox technique that violated culinary school doctrine but made perfect thermal sense. Fourth discovery, the strategic positioning. When both Wellingtons were ready for the oven, the difference in approach became visually obvious. Thomas placed his in the center rack of the convection oven, where computer-controlled fans would circulate heat precisely. David studied his deck oven carefully, feeling the heat zones with his hand. He positioned his Wellington in the back half of the oven, where the heating element created the hottest zone, but angled it so the thickest part of the beef faced the heat, while the pastry ends extended toward the cooler front zone. The beef needs aggressive heat to finish cooking. The pastry needs gentler heat to crisp without burning. Uneven heat distribution solves both problems simultaneously if you position the dish correctly. Thomas checked his oven after 15 minutes, standard protocol. His Wellington looked beautiful on top, golden brown and glossy from the egg wash. But when he inserted a probe thermometer into the beef, his expression fell. The center was at 118 degrees Fahrenheit, nowhere near the 130 degrees Fahrenheit target for medium rare. David didn't check his Wellington at all. He stood with his eyes closed, listening. The sound of the oven, the pattern of sizzling, the smell of browning pastry, all provided data points. At exactly 19 minutes, he opened the deck oven and removed his Wellington. No thermometer check. Pure instinct built on thousands of hours in field kitchens where thermometers didn't exist or didn't work. Thomas's Wellington came out at 26 minutes, the maximum time before the top would burn. He knew immediately something was wrong. The pastry bottom felt soft when he moved it to the cutting board. Catherine Morrison approached both stations with clinical professionalism. Both dishes must rest for exactly 10 minutes before cutting. This ensures juice redistribution and final temperature carryover. The Instagram live viewer count hit 200,000. Major food media outlets had picked up the stream and were sharing it across their platforms. This was becoming one of the most watched culinary events in social media history. The 10-minute rest period felt like hours. Marcus paced near the windows, his usual confidence replaced by something resembling fear. His entire empire rested on the next 15 minutes. Thomas stared at his Wellington, knowing before cutting that the structural integrity was compromised. The bottom would be soggy, the same failure pattern they'd seen 87 times before. David stood calmly, his hands resting on the counter, his grandfather's voice providing comfort. "Trust the food, Mijo. When you listen correctly, it never lies." The judges took their positions. Knives were prepared. Cameras focused. The world watched. Chapter 9. The Triumphant Test. Target, 780 words. Catherine Morrison raised her hand for silence. "We'll evaluate based on 5 criteria: pastry integrity, beef doneness and consistency, structural stability, flavor balance, and overall presentation. Each dish will be plated identically and served blind to our judging panel." She personally cut and plated portions from both Wellingtons, using careful technique to preserve structure. The difference was immediately visible even before tasting. Thomas's Wellington, despite its beautiful golden top, collapsed slightly when cut. The pastry bottom had dissolved into paste that clung to the cutting board. The beef's interior revealed the telltale gradient of overcooked edges and undercooked center, a band of gray meat surrounding a cool red core. David's Wellington, by contrast, sliced cleanly. The knife passed through the pastry with satisfying resistance, the layers clearly defined and crispy throughout. When the slice was lifted, the pastry bottom remained intact, perfectly golden and structurally sound. The beef's interior showed an even rosy pink from edge to edge, with only a thin line of gray at the very surface where the sear had been. The Instagram comments erupted. "Look at that cut. The pastry is actually holding. How is the beef perfectly even?" Catherine plated both dishes on identical white plates and brought them to the judging table, which had been positioned away from the prep stations. A screen was erected so the judges couldn't see which chef had prepared which dish. They would identify them simply as Dish A and Dish B. James Whitmore, the Times critic, cut into Dish A, Thomas's Wellington, first. His fork pressed through the golden top, but the bottom offered little resistance. He lifted a bite, and a visible piece of soggy pastry clung to the bottom, dripping liquid onto the plate. He chewed slowly, his expression professional and unreadable. Then he made notes in his leather journal without speaking. The silence was damning. Chef Daniel Corso went next, his decades of Michelin experience evident in how he evaluated the dish. He pressed the pastry with his fork, testing structural integrity. He examined the beef's color gradation. He smelled the dish before tasting, checking the aromatic balance. His first bite confirmed what his visual inspection suggested. "The flavors are sophisticated," he said carefully, his Italian accent adding weight to each word. "The duxelle is well prepared, the prosciutto adds proper saltiness. But the execution has fundamental flaws. The pastry bottom is compromised. The beef has a temperature gradient of approximately 20 degrees from edge to center." Catherine Morrison tasted Dish A last. As a Michelin consultant, she'd evaluated thousands of dishes at three-star restaurants. Her standards were unforgiving. "This would not pass for three-star consideration," she said simply. "Technical execution matters at this level. The dish tastes good, but good isn't sufficient." The kitchen staff exchanged glances. Thomas Wu looked down at his cutting board, his shoulders sagging with exhausted acceptance. Now came Dish B, David's Wellington. James Whitmore cut through the pastry, and his eyebrows raised immediately. The fork met even resistance throughout, top, middle, and bottom layers all maintaining their integrity. He lifted the bite, and it held together perfectly, no dripping, no collapsing structure. His expression changed the moment he tasted it. He closed his eyes, chewing slowly, then opened them with something approaching wonder. "This is extraordinary. The pastry has actual texture, crisp layers that don't dissolve. The beef is perfectly cooked throughout, no gradient, just consistent medium rare from edge to edge." He took another bite, examining the components. The duxelle has breadcrumbs, which is technically crude by French standards, but it works brilliantly. The moisture is controlled, and there's something about the beef's temperature curve. It's warm but not hot, suggesting it entered the oven already partially up to temperature. Chef Corso cut his portion with visible anticipation. His first bite produced a smile, rare for a chef known for his stern evaluations. This is how beef Wellington is supposed to be executed. The pastry is British style, thicker and sturdier than French puff, but that's correct for this application. The beef is perfectly uniform, which suggests sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics. He examined the bottom pastry layer, pressing it with his fork. Whoever made this understood that pastry structure matters more than delicate layers for this dish. They also understood heat distribution. This was not cooked in a convection oven. This came from a deck oven with uneven heat, positioned to exploit hot and cool zones. Catherine Morrison's evaluation was clinical and thorough. She dissected the dish like a surgeon, examining every element, every junction point where components met. After several minutes of silent analysis, she set down her fork and looked directly at the screen that separated the judges from the kitchen. This dish represents three-star technical execution. More than that, it represents deep understanding of culinary history and purpose. Whoever prepared Dish B didn't just follow a recipe. They understood what the dish was designed to accomplish and adapted technique accordingly. She paused, then added, "In 30 years of consulting for Michelin, I've rarely encountered this level of intuitive engineering in the kitchen. This isn't just cooking. This is culinary architecture." The verdict was unanimous. Dish B was superior in every measurable category and most subjective ones. Catherine Morrison stood and gestured toward the screen. Remove the barrier. Let's see who our chefs are. The screen was lowered. The judges saw Thomas Wu standing by Dish A, his team surrounding him in their pristine chef's whites. And they saw David Martinez standing alone by Dish B, still wearing his weathered military jacket over a borrowed apron, his calloused hands resting calmly on the counter. The judges' expressions shifted through surprise, confusion, then understanding as Marcus Chun explained the challenge terms and David's background. Chef Corso approached David's station, examining the Wellington that remained. He cut another slice, studying the cross-section with professional fascination. Where did you train? Culinary Institute of America, sir. Then 10 years as a military cook in Afghanistan. And the technique? This hybrid approach, British pastry handling with French flavor profiles, using uneven heat distribution strategically. My grandfather taught me that dishes have their own requirements. You can't force French technique onto British food architecture. And military cooking taught me that perfect equipment isn't necessary if you understand thermodynamics and work with your limitations instead of against them. James Whitmore was already typing on his phone, his article taking shape in real time. This was the story he'd been waiting his entire career to write. The Instagram live viewer count had reached 400,000. Comments scrolled in dozens of languages, chefs from around the world discussing what they'd just witnessed. Several culinary schools were already sharing the video as teaching material about intuitive technique versus rote learning. Marcus Chin stood frozen near the expo line, his face pale with the realization of what had just occurred. A homeless veteran with PTSD had solved in 2 hours what $180,000 in consultants and 11 weeks of effort had failed to achieve. But more than that, the solution was elegant, accessible, and obvious in hindsight. David hadn't used expensive ingredients or specialized equipment. He'd used understanding, adaptation, and respect for the dish's historical purpose. Catherine Morrison approached Marcus with professional directness. Mr. Chun, you made an offer in front of witnesses, media representatives, and several 100,000 online viewers. I trust you intend to honor your commitment. The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of kitchen ventilation and the clicking of smartphones recording every moment. Marcus looked at David, then at the judges, then at the perfect Wellington that represented everything his restaurant needed. His empire hung in balance. Honor the deal and admit his judgment had been catastrophically wrong, or refuse and face viral destruction plus potential legal consequences. A deal is a deal, Marcus finally said, his voice steady despite his shattered ego. David Martinez, effective immediately, you're the head chef of Chin's Metropolitan, with all associated compensation and authority. The kitchen erupted in applause, genuine celebration from staff who'd spent 11 weeks watching their executive chef struggle. They'd witnessed something rare, competence triumphing over credentials, wisdom defeating assumptions. But David held up his hand, silencing the celebration. I'll accept on one condition. Marcus's expression flickered with suspicion. A condition? You're negotiating after I've offered you everything. David met his gaze with calm authority. Thomas Wu and his team have been executing your vision for 11 weeks under impossible pressure. They're not failures. They were using the wrong equipment and the wrong conceptual approach. I won't take Thomas's position. I'll work alongside him as co-executive chef, or I don't accept at all. The kitchen fell silent. Thomas looked up sharply, his expression transforming from defeated exhaustion to shocked gratitude. Chef Corso smiled broadly. That's the mark of a true leader. Understanding that the problem wasn't the people, it was the framework. Catherine Morrison nodded approvingly. Mr. Chun, I suggest you accept those terms. You're not just getting a chef, you're getting someone who understands team dynamics and systemic issues. That's worth more than technical skill alone. Marcus hesitated only a moment. Agreed. Co-executive chefs. You'll restructure the kitchen program together and prepare for Friday's Michelin visit. David extended his hand to Thomas, who shook it firmly. I'd be honored to learn your French technique properly. My approach is functional, but your team's precision and organization are exceptional. Together, we can create something neither of us could do alone. The Instagram live comments exploded with emotional responses. This is leadership, crying at a cooking video WTF. Someone give this man his own show. James Whitmore finished typing and looked up. Mr. Martinez, I'm writing a feature article for tomorrow's Times. The Wellington Solution. How a homeless veteran solved Manhattan's most expensive culinary problem. I'd like to interview you properly about your grandfather, your military service, and your philosophy. Chef Corso pulled out a business card. I'm opening a restaurant in Los Angeles focused on military veterans transitioning to culinary careers. I want you to consult on the program design. Whatever your rate is, I'll pay it. Catherine Morrison was more direct. I'm recommending to Michelin that they send their inspector to Chin's Metropolitan this Friday as planned. But I'm also recommending that they consider the innovative approach demonstrated here as evidence of the kind of culinary evolution that deserves 3-star recognition. She turned to Marcus. However, I'm also recommending a formal review of your hiring and evaluation practices. A CIA-trained chef with military experience was sleeping in your alley for 4 months while you spent $180,000 on consultants. That represents a catastrophic failure in talent recognition that should concern your investors. Marcus's face flushed, but he nodded acceptance. The viral video had already made denial impossible. David's transformation was complete. In less than 3 hours, he'd evolved from invisible homeless veteran to celebrated executive chef, from overlooked outcast to sought-after consultant. The Michelin crisis was resolved. The restaurant's future was secured, and Chin's Metropolitan would become famous not just for its food, but for the story of redemption and recognition that unfolded in its kitchen. But the most important consequences were still unfolding. Justice was being served in ways both public and private, both immediate and systemic. The viral video had reached 600,000 views and was still climbing. The real reckoning was just beginning. The Instagram live stream ended, but the digital wildfire was just beginning. Within 2 hours, the video had been shared across every major platform: Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, LinkedIn. By midnight, it had reached 2.3 million views. By morning, it was approaching 10 million. Major media outlets picked up the story. CNN ran a segment titled "Homeless Veteran Solves Manhattan Restaurant's Crisis." Good Morning America requested interviews. The story transcended food media and entered mainstream cultural conversation about veterans' affairs, homelessness, and corporate America's failure to recognize talent. Marcus Chin's investors convened an emergency board meeting. The viral video had created unexpected publicity. Chin's Metropolitan's reservation system crashed from overwhelming demand. But it had also exposed systematic failures in leadership judgment that concerned people whose money funded the operation. Patricia Blackwell, the lead investor who'd contributed $800,000 to the restaurant's expansion, spoke with cold precision during the video conference. Marcus, explain how a CIA-trained chef with distinguished military service was sleeping in your alley for 4 months while you spent our money on consultants who failed to solve a problem he fixed in 2 hours. Marcus had no good answer. His attempts to explain sounded like excuses. I didn't know his background. He looked homeless. There was no formal application. That's precisely the problem, Patricia interrupted. Your evaluation system is based entirely on appearance and credentials rather than capability. That represents a fundamental failure in judgment that could have cost us our entire investment. The board's decision was swift and proportional. Marcus would retain ownership and the CEO title. They weren't interested in forcing a sale during the current publicity. But he would cede operational control to a newly formed advisory board that included David and Thomas. His salary would be reduced by 35%, with the difference redirected to a veteran hiring initiative. Additionally, Marcus would be required to undergo comprehensive training in inclusive leadership, unconscious bias, and veteran employment best practices. The trainer would be someone he'd personally overlooked, a homeless veteran now proven to be one of Manhattan's most talented chefs. The PR firm Marcus hired to manage the crisis delivered uncomfortable truths. The viral video had made him a symbol of corporate arrogance and privilege. His only path to redemption was genuine change, not damage control. You need to be part of the solution, the PR director explained. The public will forgive mistakes if they see real transformation, but they'll destroy you if this seems like performance. 3 weeks later, Chin's Metropolitan implemented sweeping changes. The restaurant partnered with the Veterans Culinary Foundation to create a formal apprenticeship program. Military veterans would receive paid training positions with clear advancement pathways. Background checks would focus on criminal history, not housing status or employment gaps. Marcus personally visited homeless shelters and veterans organizations, not with press photographers, but with genuine job offers and apologies for his previous blindness. The New York Times article ran with a photo of David and Thomas working side by side in the kitchen, both in chef's whites, their contrasting backgrounds united by shared purpose. The article's final paragraph noted, "Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from unexpected teachers." Marcus Chun learned that expensive equipment and prestigious consultants matter less than wisdom, adaptability, and respect for talent regardless of its packaging. The most satisfying moment came 6 weeks later when Marcus approached David in the kitchen during prep time. Staff were busy with their stations, unaware of the conversation. "I owe you more than a job," Marcus said quietly. "You taught me that success isn't about control and intimidation. It's about recognizing excellence and building teams that function despite my ego, not because of it." David looked at him with the same grace his grandfather had shown to officers who'd initially dismissed his cooking. "Everyone deserves the chance to grow, Marcus. The question is whether you're ready to keep listening with the same attention you now give to that deck oven." 8 months later, David Martinez stood in Chin's Metropolitan's expanded kitchen, watching as 3 new veteran apprentices learned the techniques that bridged military discipline with culinary artistry. His co-executive chef title now shared wall space in his new apartment with his CIA diploma, his grandfather's photograph, and the framed New York Times article. The Michelin inspector had returned that Friday as scheduled. Chin's Metropolitan earned its 3rd star, one of only 14 restaurants in New York to hold that distinction. The inspection report specifically praised the beef Wellington as a masterclass in respecting culinary tradition while employing innovative technique. Roberto Martinez's garage wisdom had evolved into a Manhattan culinary institution that trained dozens of veterans annually. His philosophy about food, not caring about credentials, had become the foundation for a program that changed lives. Chef Corso's Los Angeles Veterans Restaurant, Mess Hall, opened with David as chief consultant. 6 locations were planned across the country. Thomas Wu was developing the Paris expansion. Sometimes the most powerful talent comes wrapped in the most unexpected packages. The question isn't who has the resume. It's who has the wisdom to truly understand the problem. If this story inspired you to look beyond assumptions and recognize hidden excellence, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Have you ever witnessed someone's potential being completely overlooked? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might become our next viral story of justice and recognition. Watch closely at minute 4:15. There's a detail about the deck oven that reveals why Marcus's expensive equipment was failing. Spot it.